computer. Fine. Okay. So in connection with teaching Milton's Paradise Lost, I'm just going back to something that I've been interested in for many, many years. And that is the role that philosophical languages play in really the eventual loss of status to the poetic. That's to say, I'm interested in looking at the ways in which changes in the way people thought about metaphysics also changed the way people thought about poetics. Now, I know that metaphysics doesn't seem to, well, first of all, like, who cares about metaphysics, or why should we care about it, or what even is it? I mean, it seems kind of arcane and not really connected to things that we're interested in, meaning who cares about metaphysics in the 21st century? But I think in some ways, and I hope you can see this passage from John Donne right now, I think in some ways, we can really relate if we make the intellectual leap that we need to make. We can relate to the metaphysics of the poets, let's say, for example, John Milton and also John Donne. Milton and Donne, T.S. Eliot writes a famous essay about what he calls the dissociation of sensibility, that at a certain time, poets stopped writing good poetry because they no longer related soul and matter, mind and body. Those two things became separate. And in Eliot's account, which is really, for him, it really is just a way in which Eliot constructs his own poetic identity. I mean, that's how I would understand it first and foremost. For Eliot, Donne stands as kind of the center of a poetic that succeeds. So if you were to write a kind of bumpkin historiographical timeline, Donne would be the perfect metaphysical poet. I mean, Donne is the figure that Eliot celebrates in his essay called Metaphysical Poetry for bringing those two things together. Interestingly, and this is another story as well, Eliot does not like Donne, does not like Milton. I think that also has to do with Eliot's own self-construction as a poet and his resistance to a certain kind of Protestantism. But again, that's another story. But the historical story, the historiographical story that Eliot tells is one which tips us off to a certain kind of poetry during this period, during the 17th century. And Donne especially, and also Milton, kind of exist between the two bookends of medieval metaphysics, obviously based upon Christianity, and the philosophical metaphysics that develops in the 17th and 18th century, with really the beginning of modern philosophy in figures like Descartes and Spinoza. We'll really focus on Descartes today. And we focus on Descartes because we essentially accept a Cartesian world. The world that we live in is one that is pretty much based upon Cartesian assumptions. So even going backwards, starting with Descartes, Descartes presupposes or assumes, doesn't presuppose, he assumes a dualism, meaning there's something called a spiritual reality and there's something called a physical reality. And those two things are separate. Earlier, in a Catholic context, there is a similar separation between spirit and matter, that there's a very strong assumption about the separation between spiritual and physical worlds. Of course, they come together in that privileged sign, the Eucharist, in which mind and spirit and body come together in the figure of Jesus. Jesus himself is that privileged form of mediation. He represents both spirit and body, spirit in the flesh. Theological languages deal much better with this kind of contradiction because for them, in theological languages, the relationship between spirit and body can be handled through poetry, through paradox, through different kinds of understandings of time, different narrative perspectives. All of these things function. And I think the simple one for our purposes now is paradox. All of these things function in a theological context in a way in which they will not function in a philosophical context. The question, though, again, is why care about metaphysics? And one way of kind of getting into this question is understanding a kind of very strange and seemingly minor part of Cartesian philosophy. And that's his belief that there's a part of the body called the pineal gland in the brain, which for him is the seat of the soul in the body. That is, Descartes, though on the one hand, is insistent upon the separation between mind and matter, nonetheless has to find a way in which mind is present to the world. Mind is present to body. In a parallel way, a way in which we can understand that God is present in the world. So not only in the mind of man, but also in the universe itself. Now, I'm just trying to put myself in this 17th century perspective, when suddenly this is becoming a major philosophical issue. And metaphysics is not just a question of like, oh, what makes sense to me? Metaphysical assumptions will underwrite everything. Meaning the way I understand metaphysics will obviously, maybe not obviously, will help me understand God, the world, and also we'll see poetry. 17th century poetry cannot be understood without understanding the Christian context and the Christian languages. That's a turnoff for a lot of people, but if one learns to bracket the Christianity and try to learn from somebody who's different from us, which I know in our generation is something that we cannot assume. And it's very hard for many of us to learn from people who don't share all of our assumptions. Being a good reader means being able to do that. And being able to say, you know what, I can maintain who I am and read a Christian reader sympathetically, meaning trying to find out what he's saying, or what she is saying. So metaphysics, we'll see, affects poetry. It affects theology. And going back to Descartes' pineal gland, what's bothering him that he has to come up with this crazy idea? Which, meaning, here's a part of the physical body, which is both body and spirit. So Descartes, through doing this, is trying to guarantee the place of the spirit in the body. Meaning he doesn't want to go all the way with his dualism. He doesn't want to separate spirit and body altogether, mind and body altogether. He wants to maintain that connection. Now, what's at stake at this? Well, one way of looking at it quickly before we look at the poets in between is to see really, in the 17th century, there were several major Darth Vader figures, I think at least 3 of them. One is Darth Vader Thomas Hobbes. The other is Darth Vader enthusiasm, which has to do with Civil War inspiration that leads to all kinds of people saying all kinds of crazy things, which they act on. And maybe Darth Vader Catholic Church in the 18th century, or Catholicism. I don't even know what the third one is. But for our purposes, Hobbes is certainly Darth Vader number 1. Why do people despise Hobbes? Why is Hobbes a figure as a philosopher who people don't just say, we don't like him, but we're afraid of him? We're afraid of him to the extent that we cannot let him infect our worldview. And here, let's just start with a piece from Leviathan. I don't even know what he's defining here. I put this up out of something else. We'll see in a minute. And according to this acceptation of the word, substance and body signify the same thing. I don't know. I'm not enough of a philosopher to know when these. Where is Hobbes coming from in Leviathan that he's using these terms so confidently? When is Descartes writing? When is Hobbes reading Descartes? when do these philosophical languages really start to take off? In many ways, they go back to Francis Bacon, who provides the methodological underpinnings of science without being a scientist. And here Hobbes is what we would call a kind of natural philosopher. And I understand by that, a natural philosopher is someone who extrapolates his understandings of philosophy from an understanding of the world. So in that way, he's close to Bacon, Bacon being one of the first. I mean, if you remember that book, When You Were Not Me, and you bought it, when you were a freshman, which was British Empiricism, which starts with Bacon, Hobbes, and Locke. So Bacon, Hobbes, and Locke are in that empirical tradition, which for our purposes just means a turning back to the world, a turning away from the ideal and ideas. And in some ways, this rejects a certain idea that's associated with Plato, or a rejection with idealism and a certain kind of, or a version of Platonic philosophy, and a turn towards the physical. So here, Hobbes just is like Bacon, and I think Locke, to maybe a lesser extent, is very, very interested in definitions. He wants to define words because he finds that the idea that people do not agree on definitions leads to confusion in the world, and he wants to. And much of his work, much of the Leviathan, is really the definition of terms, which for us means having a common language. So he's going and he's defining, or I think he's come across a term or phrase which he doesn't like. And according to this acceptation of the word, substance and body signify the same thing. And so, therefore, substance incorporeal, let's sit on that. Substance incorporeal, substance being physical, incorporeal being spiritual, are words which they, when they are joined together, destroy one another, as if a man should say, an incorporeal body, which Hobbes finds to be a ludicrous paradox. There is no such thing as an incorporeal body. Bodies and spirits are different. The physical world and the spiritual world, which Hobbes devotes 2 books of his Leviathan to a Christian commonwealth. And whether or not Hobbes believes in a spiritual world or not, and he might not, the only thing that for Hobbes is knowable is the physical world. That's it. And to say that the spiritual in any way makes an impression on the physical world is just bad philosophy. Okay, fine. So what's so bad about Hobbes? What's so terrifying about his vision of the world? Well, it's a world without spirit. It's a world that's entirely understood in terms of matter. When Hobbes, at the beginning of Leviathan, opens up, he gives a definition of man where man is almost like a mechanism, like a machine, reactive to other physical forces in the world. This, if you're thinking to yourself, well, what about free will? Yeah, that's a good question. What about free will? And Hobbes argues with a contemporary clergyman about the relationship between free will and determinism or providence, providence being the more theological term, determinism being the more philosophical one. And guess which side Hobbes takes? Hobbes takes the side of determinism. This is one of the reasons I sometimes laugh when outlining the problem of providence, of God's knowing human action and free will. When I outline that in Milton, and some very diligent student will raise their hand and explain how you can accommodate both providence and free will. But it's nice, and I don't really laugh, and I certainly try to be encouraging, but really the fact that Hobbes and Bishop, the name will come to me, and the bishop spent so much time arguing this really shows that the kinds of things that we say at Shabbat tables to satisfy ourselves are often really not enough to deal with all the problems that such issues raise. Hobbes, as a materialist, then is really emptying the world of spirit and emptying the world of God. Okay, well, that's bad, right? Just going back, here's a poem by John Donne. The central stanza of a poem by Donne called the Canonization. A poem which announces itself by its title to be theological in nature, but it turns out not to be about the canonizing of saints, which is how the term is used, but it's used metaphorically. The theological frame or vehicle is used metaphorically to talk about the tenor, that is what the poem is really about love. So a poem which we expect to be about a theological experience, in actuality is about the love between not man and God, but man and a woman. So here, looking at Donne, and with Donne we're going back in time 40, 50 years before Hobbes takes the possibility of the incorporeal body out of the world, and we're seeing how Donne relates the relationship between these two things in poetic language. This poem, as some of you will surely know from whatever freshman poetry class you took in college, begins with, "For God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love." All of Donne's poems are dramatic. There are three characters in this poem. One is Donne himself, the lover, the poet, as it were. The other is his beloved, and the third is the person to whom he's calling out at the beginning of this stanza, but also at the beginning of the poem. "For God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love." It goes on, and here's the poet turning to a friend who's telling him, stop wasting your time, do something with your life. And to that, Donne responds, "For God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love. You find something that's worthwhile for you to do, and I never hurt anybody with my love. Leave us alone. We're lovers. You do whatever else you're up to." In the third stanza, the drama switches or represents a certain kind of name call, to which Donne, we never hear the voice of the guy outside, we hear Donne responding to him, and the poet says, "Call us what you will, we are made such by love." So there's been some name calling going on. That is, having given up the rational conversation, the friend or the observer outside starts calling names. What kind of names? "Call her one, me another, fly." So one way of understanding how 17th century people thought about flies is the same way that some people think about rabbits today. Have you ever heard the expression, this is for kids only on YouTube, "they blank like rabbits"? Well, the same thing was thought about flies, that they live very short but procreative lives. So that's I guess that's kind of a put down for people who are just, who are understood entirely in terms of their sexuality. Meaning one student years and years ago, Miri, if you're out there, years and years ago, she pointed out that the outsider is kind of a Baconian observer who only sees the physical. He also maybe is a kind of a predecessor to Descartes in seeing the separation between mind and body. So this Baconian outsider looks at these lovers, and all he sees is what's that expression? Public display, PDA. All he sees are public displays of affection, and he calls them flies or bunnies or rabbits or whatever. So here then, the poet takes over. Here's Donne doing his thing, the poet kind of not really showing off. I mean, in my metaphor, the poet's synapses are firing very quickly, meaning he associates quickly, or that's what he represents here, where tapers to, that is candles, and at her own cost die. Call her one, me another fly, where tapers to and at her own cost die. Tapers are candles that are, I guess, tapering out, dying out, because candles, as they burn out, burn to nothing. And Donne defines that, where tapers to and at our own cost die. Donne may be the dirtiest of 17th century poets. maybe even dirtier than Shakespeare. I'm not really sure. I mean, anybody who thinks that we go back to the Renaissance and we see a very prim and polite society, that's coming in the 18th century, but there's also issues with that. Anybody who wants to see a prim and polite society in Shakespeare or Donne will not find them, meaning Donne and Shakespeare take much more liberties than we could possibly imagine. Donne's famous poem that you may know is called The Flea. And there's a lot of sucking in that poem, sucking of blood, and the word is repeated over and over again, and Donne is also aware of the typographical convention, the printing convention, in which S's and F's are exchanged in 17th century printing. So when you read suck, it doesn't really look like suck. Again, this is for kids. It looks like that other word, not the S word, but the F word. I mean, he intends this. Here, you may remember from your undergraduate career reading Antony and Cleopatra, in which Antony is going on about dying all the time. And dying in that poem not only has to do with death, it has to do with the petite mort, the small death that's described in French as an orgasm. We're tapers to and at our own cost die. The small death of sexual consummation. So maybe you would say I'm overreading it, reading too much to it. Fine, maybe, but it's there in that word during that period. It's in Donne's poetic toolbox. He continues, well, how did he get from fly to tapers? Well, flies, which might also be called moths, I don't know. Flies are, or actually my window was open last night, and flies did come into my computer. Flies are attracted to the light, so we get from flies to light, and the candles are going out, and we and us find the eagle and the dove. Now the poet is naming both himself and his lover. How did we get from flies to tapers to eagles and doves? I guess we go from flies or moths to eagles and doves, these creatures that fly. And we have a kind of dichotomy here between what in the Renaissance would be the masculine eagle and the feminine dove. And then there's a further contraction, or a further shift, a further association, fly to eagle and dove, and there is a contraction of the masculine and feminine into the phoenix. The phoenix is that bird, that mythical bird. There's only one of them at a time. How do they procreate? They don't. They die and rise after they die. And we in us find the eagle and the dove. The Phoenix Riddle hath more wit by us. We two being one are in. Clever Donne, right? So we take the eagle and the dove. They're separate. And then Donne, as he very often does in his love poems, shows the way in which lovers are simultaneously different, but on some level the same. The Phoenix Riddle, that's what he tries to convince his beloved in the poem of Valediction Forbidding Morning. I'm not really going away. I'm really here with you. She doesn't buy it for most of the poem. And eventually, Donne the poet comes up with a metaphor that she buys into. Here, the Phoenix Riddle in the middle of the poem, in the middle of the stanza, the Phoenix Riddle hath more wit by us, we two being one are it. So to one neutral things both sexes fit. Very romantic. We die and rise the same and prove mysterious by this love. So here Donne is doing things that 18th century critics and probably poets as well will not approve of. By the time Samuel Johnson reads this poem in the mid-18th century, he has already entered a different cultural mindset, one in which Donne's poetry makes no sense. It's almost for Johnson like he's reading from the perspective of Hobbes's substance incorporeal. It doesn't make sense. In A Valediction Forbidding Morning, Donne compares his lover and himself to two compasses, you know, the thing that makes circles. And Johnson says something to the effect of, who would compare lovers to compasses? Meaning that comparison doesn't make sense. Therefore, Johnson, that comparison is merely inelegant. For him, Donne is not only inelegant, it's heretical. How can you compare the love between lovers to the Christian mystery. And reading the last two lines of the stanza, we see, in fact, that that is what Donne is doing. We die and rise the same. The Phoenix Riddle is a model for Christ. We die and rise the same. Here, it's not Christ who is dying and rising the same, but the lovers, and prove mysterious by this love. Mystery here has that sense of, well, it's definitely not the, Agatha Christie Murder, She Wrote mystery. I'm dating myself, whatever one applies now. It's not that kind of detective story, Sherlock Holmes mystery, but rather it's a kind of Christian mystery, a sacred mystery. We die and rise the same and prove mysterious by this love. That is, if you're not convinced that this really is Christian, and Donne really is sanctifying the physical relationship between man and women with this Christian framework, this Christian metaphorical setup, which we see begins with the canonization, the title, here we see we die and rise the same and prove mysterious by this love. Our love now partakes of the same sacred qualities of the Christian mystery. I started off by saying Donne is rebelling against older dualisms. I mean, certainly it was thought up until this period, really the classical doctrinal Catholic perspective is that the marriage is for procreation. And if you're unhappy with your spouse, well, tough. God sanctifies the marriage. And if you're not satisfied with it, you're not satisfied with that relationship, you have no choice. You can't divorce. Because God doesn't really care whether or not you get along with your spouse and go to the same movies or like the same books. God cares that you fulfill that process, that sacred process of procreation. It's Milton in the 17th century. Of course, he wants to divorce his wife, blah, blah, blah. He does want to divorce his wife. He has no doctrinal precedent in the church for justifying that. So he writes 4 divorce tracts. And his claim in his divorce tract is that if you value marriage, you will necessarily value divorce. Because if you don't value divorce, you don't understand what marriage is. Because marriage is presupposed upon, is based upon this mutual conversation and interchange. And if you don't have that, you don't have a marriage. So here, in this poem, Donne is celebrating, I mean, it's heteronormative, I get that, but he is celebrating the relationship between a man and a woman independent of its sacred function. In fact, independent of its sacred function, it itself becomes sacred. It becomes sacred through being human in a way, or Donne is attributing to the human sacred qualities, a sacred aspect. It's worth mentioning, speaking about heteronormative, that there is a poem later on in the century by Catherine Phillips, in which she's writing to her, not lover, or her friend, as she calls her, and that's about women's love. And where Donne's poetry, where his version of the valediction forbidding mourning, the compasses are certainly, there is a hierarchical relationship between the masculine and the feminine. The woman stays home, the masculine travels. In Phillips's version of that poem of the compasses, they have an equal relationship. So I'm just saying that this sacred aspect to lovers also will apply to friends, whether or not Phillips was really whether her friends were really lovers is really not that important. Really is not that important in reading her poems. She does love her friends, that's for sure. But here Donne is initiating that moment where we're saying the relationship between men and women itself has a sacred quality. But not only that, so that's Dr. Johnson, and he will always be in our discussions, our bumpkin 18th century sensibility, not because Johnson was a bumpkin, he certainly wasn't, but because he almost typically in relationship to 17th century poetry, has the same misreadings. He always misreads 17th century poems because 17th century poetry is continually violating his categories. Donne is guilty of category violation. What do I mean by that? He's mixing up stuff that doesn't belong together. Don't talk about lovers and theology in the same verse. An earlier poet, a contemporary of Donne, wrote, don't write about, he had some other nicer word for it, don't write about whorehouses at the same time you write about mathematics. Don't use one to compare to the other. Metaphors are a form by which we compare one thing to another. Don't use theological languages to describe something that is merely secular romantic. Those are two separate things. So Donne is doing just that here. But even worse than that, we die and rise the same. So we read that as Christian and prove mysterious by this love. But even worse than that, and this is where Donne certainly earns the disdain of the 18th century, we die and rise the same sexual, right? Here Donne is talking about, and he's not shy about doing this in other of his poems, we die, and now it's not the we of before, we two being or one. I mean, it's that, but it's also the masculine we. We die, male orgasm, and rise the same and prove mysterious by this love. Orgasm and rising, orgasm and erection. I'm sorry, people, as I told you, Donne gets a, does he get a PG rating or an R rating? One or the other, right? And here, here you see Dr. Johnson throwing up his hands. Not only is Donne using theological language to ennoble the relationship between men and women, but he is using theological language, or he's using the most graphic, to Johnson himself, the most vulgar physical language in order to describe the spiritual. Dr. Johnson writes in his most famous work, which is on not Donne but Cowley, one of Donne's followers, which is like if you thought Donne was bad, you look at his followers, they're even worse. I think there's a poet, Crashaw, and he compares angels to toilet bowls. He really does. To little flying toilets. It's a great moment in poetic history. So Johnson says of that kind of poetry, the most heterogeneous ideas yoked by violence together. The most heterogeneous ideas yoked by violence together, or really what he calls a discordia concourse, a discordant harmony. I mean, there are parts in which it seems Johnson, unknown to himself, is generous. I mean, I read Discordia Concourse is nice. It's a very old trope. It goes back to the classical tradition, and it's understood as a discordant harmony. It's a paradox, right? Meaning the two things rest, they're simultaneously opposites, but also there's a similarity. There's something harmonious between them. So Donne, or Johnson, says Donne and his school take the most heterogeneous ideas, things that do not belong together, and they yoke them by violence together. So Johnson is saying, really, these poets don't really discover anything about the world. They have very rich associative imaginations, and they put things together that really don't belong together. We might get pleasure out of them. Johnson says as much. We're surprised by them. We might get but Johnson says whatever pleasure we get from them is short-lived, because the kind of pleasure they give is the pleasure of the aesthetic only, and has no truth value. That Donne, from Johnson's perspective, invents relationships between things that are unlike. He does not discover something that's really there. He does not discover what occult qualities might join these, what secret qualities might join these together. I mean, how can lovers really be like this compared to the Phoenix and the Christian mystery? Well, I said at the beginning, we might relate more to Donne's Donne's metaphysics as 21st century people, because we do tend to think of romantic relationships in just these kinds of sacred terms. And Donne is one of the first people to do that. we look at the possibilities of the relationship between humans as having this sacred aspect. I'm using the term we in very broad senses, but I think experientially in many different cultures, secular cultures, theological cultures, we look at the possibility of a relationship as rising to the level of the sacred. And that is very clearly what Donne is doing here. So we can already see just temporally, right? Donne before Hobbes. Hobbes doesn't even bother with Donne. Hobbes will say in addition, and I think maybe we'll round out our discussion. This will be part one of the series called The Death of Poetry. Hobbes in Leviathan takes terms that have been in circulation for a while and understood in different ways. Those terms are, ready, fancy and judgment. Fancy, says Hobbes, and we might understand that as imagination. I think Bacon and Hobbes both use that term as well. But fancy for Hobbes is the faculty of the mind that finds similarities between things. And then there is judgment, that faculty of the mind that finds differences. Francis Bacon, earlier in his Latin treatise called the Novum Organum, look at aphorism number 55. Bacon says there are two kinds of people in this world. There are kinds of people that see similarities, and there are people who see differences. They both err, they both make mistakes, says Bacon. Bacon himself is very much of the difference, of the judgment camp. He's also acutely aware of what he thinks are the misleading tendencies of the poet, of the imagination, of fancy, for showing similarities in things that really are different. And Bacon, as an empiricist, is devoted to seeing those differences. It's not, however, until Hobbes that the different faculties are seen in very clear hierarchical terms. Not only the preference of one over the other, but Hobbes saying one is good for new philosophy and one is not. That is, poets, as Hobbes, remember that book, Bacon, Hobbes, Locke, as Hobbes's follower Locke will say, poets mislead through their similitudes. They make comparisons that mislead us. Locke is basically saying, and this is what happens in the 17th century, is saying, stick to philosophers. Poets will mislead you. Hobbes does admit, and I think Locke does as well, that poetry delights. For those of you who are thinking back to older defenses of poetry, those of you who maybe have read Aristotle a billion years ago, or read Sir Philip Sidney's Defense of Poetry, or even read Horace's Arts of Poetry, the Roman poet, there's that combination of delighting and teaching and delight. Aristotle is the first to bring those two things together. That is, poetry not only delights, and Plato makes a concession to poetry delighting, but it also teaches. Through imitations, we can learn. And we can learn even better, says Aristotle, and then Sidney. And we can learn even better because delight helps us to learn. Locke, interestingly, will appropriate that delight for philosophical thinking. The processes of thought for the philosopher give delight. But the poet, however, delights without teaching. And insofar that the poet delights without teaching, and this goes back to Hobbes, poets merely provide embellishment. When does the Hallmark card company, the company that makes greeting cards, birthday cards, bar mitzvah cards, communion cards, wedding cards in America, when is that the notion of the Hallmark card born? In the 17th century with Thomas Hobbes. What does poetry do? It embellishes. It makes us feel good. everybody who ever called anyone who's watching this video artsy fartsy, remember that? And I hope that's no longer in contemporary language. But whoever was called that, well, the person who was calling you that was obviously had not read Hobbes, but was taking this Hobbesian idea about poetry, and it had already become part of the culture, and that's what he's calling you, because from that perspective, that's all poetry does. Yes, it's nice. Yes, it's pretty. And yes, you know, unlike in Plato's Republic, we'll give you a place in the university. Of course, it will be underfunded, understaffed, underfunded, and you will not get a new building. Sour grapes here a little for me. And you will not get a new building, but we allow you a place at the university. Although even that, and now you can see a little bit of the contemporary frame for this, or my personal interest in this lecture series, The Death of Poetry, just born this lecture series, is that in the contemporary university, the same people who called me artsy fartsy in 6th grade are now my colleagues in the sciences. And they are the people who are deciding about tenure and promotion for my colleagues in the humanities. And they have the same assumptions, and they apply the same qualitative metrics to what we do, to what they do. That is not an auspicious thing. And they are taking the same means of reading that are used in the sciences, elaborate, productive as they are, and using them in relationship to the humanities and missing what the humanities do. There is more to heaven and earth that is dreamt of than is dreamt of in your philosophy, my dear Horatio, says Hamlet. That's what I want to say every day. I'm on this committee. I want to say every day to my colleagues in the sciences, you do not get it. And the death of poetry is more than just saying, oh, well, you know, really just affirming what we've already known, that poetry at its best makes certain people feel good, but it's not for me. Poetry teaches you to read the world in its complexity. Poetry is not bothered by paradox. And that might be a reason for scientists to say, aha, poetry is not bothered by paradox, you see? But poets and good readers will have the humility about the world that Hamlet has, and eventually Horatio gets, that the stories we tell about the world, even the most intricate and advanced scientific stories, which are more than stories, but they are productive and predictive for us, as much as they do those things, they do not get the whole world. And when we are unable to read the poetry of Donne, when we are unable to read the poetry of Milton, which we'll start with in the next installment of this lecture series, when we are unable to read the poetry of Milton, we are unable to read the world. We are unable to see the world. Those of us who are trained by scientists to read have a very specific and very, very narrow bandwidth. Don't misunderstand me. I understand that once you get into that narrow bandwidth, it expands infinitely. But and I'm sure what I'm saying right now does not apply to theoretical physicists and people who are not immersed in the day-to-day of just making stuff. Anyone who's thinking seriously about the mysteries of the universe experiences the mysteries of the universe and likely also reads a lot of poetry. Anyway, so for now, we end this talk with a promise to go back to a sensibility like we saw in Donne, to see that again in Milton, and to see what happens next after the dangers of poetry. And Milton represents, and it could be another, Darth Vader Milton is another one, meaning Milton represents almost everything that later 18th century figures want to push back and repress. In addition to his political radicalism, he helped not only in the arguments to kill the king, but also to justify the killing of the king, but he also represents this older metaphysics, this coming together of spirit and matter that people like Dr. Johnson found to be dangerous. The people like Hobbes also found to be dangerous. We'll talk more about that next time. The Death of Poetry from Jerusalem.